In a mansion where every item is tracked by smart technology, a billionaire discovers something impossible. Small things have been disappearing. Cans of soup, protein bars, antiseptic. Nothing valuable, but all missing. The system flags the same person every time. His elderly black maid, the woman who raised him after his parents died. Instead of confronting her, he makes a decision that will unravel everything he thought he knew about loyalty, sacrifice, and love. He follows her through the cold night into a neighborhood where even the streetlights have given up. What he discovers doesn't reveal a thief. It reveals a truth that brings a man who's forgotten how to feel to his knees in tears. Before we begin this journey, tell me where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow I'm sharing another story that will challenge everything you think you know about the people closest to you. Owen Caldwell didn't just control his business. He controlled his breath, his schedule, his emotions, everything. At 36, he was the youngest CEO in Caldwell Technologies history, a man who had turned grief into empire and vulnerability into armor. He moved through boardrooms like a surgeon through an operating theater, precise, unemotional, effective. People who worked for him respected his brilliance. People who tried to know him gave up quickly. He wasn't unkind. He simply operated in a world where feelings were inefficiencies, where connection was a liability he couldn't afford. That afternoon, Owen stood before 300 investors at the annual Tech Innovation Summit, delivering projections that would reshape urban infrastructure across 4 continents. His presentation was flawless. Graphs ascended on cue. Data points landed with surgical precision. When he finished, the applause came in waves, polite, professional, distant. He nodded once, shook exactly 7 hands, and left the building 4 minutes ahead of schedule. The drive back to his estate on the northern ridge was silent. Owen never played music in the car. Music invited feeling, and feeling invited distraction. Instead, he reviewed real-time analytics on his tablet. Quarterly forecasts, supply chain optimization, risk assessment algorithms. Everything was green. Everything was controlled. Everything was exactly as it should be. His mansion recognized his approach before he reached the gate. Sensors triggered. Lights adjusted to his preferred evening spectrum. The front door unlocked with a soft click as his shoe touched the welcome mat. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and something warm from the kitchen. Grace Porter was waiting in the foyer, as she had been for over 3 decades. Her silver-edged hair was pulled back neatly. Her hands, slightly swollen at the knuckles, held a folded dish towel. She didn't smile broadly anymore, the way she used to when he was small, but her eyes still carried that gentle recognition. "Evening, Mr. Caldwell," she said quietly. "Your messages are on your desk. Dinner at 7, unless you like it earlier?" "7 is fine, Grace." He moved past her toward the stairs, already pulling up another report on his phone. Grace returned to the kitchen without another word, disappearing into the rhythm of the house like she always did. She had been there since Owen was 4 years old. When the storm took his parents, when the world became too loud and too dark, Grace had been the one who sat at the edge of his bed. She had been the one who held him when nightmares ripped him from sleep. She had been the one who whispered that he was safe, that he was loved, that tomorrow would come and he would still be here. She had raised him in ways his wealth could never quantify. But time had done what time does. Distance had grown. Owen had become a man who no longer needed comfort, and Grace had become part of the architecture, present but unnoticed, essential but invisible. Later that evening, while reviewing a partnership proposal from a firm in Seoul, Owen's home management system pinged with an alert. He glanced at the screen. Inventory discrepancy flagged. 3rd occurrence in 21 days. He opened the report. The name that appeared made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years. Grace Porter. Owen stared at the screen, his finger hovering over the report details. He told himself there had to be an explanation, a system error, a logging mistake, anything but what the data was suggesting. But Owen Caldwell had built an empire on trusting data, and the data never lied. To understand why this discovery felt like betrayal, why it cut deeper than any business loss ever could, you have to understand who Owen Caldwell really was. You have to go back to the beginning, to the boy he used to be before money became his language and control became his religion. You have to understand the man behind the billion-dollar empire and how he became someone who could overlook the one person who had never overlooked him. Owen's day began the same way every morning at exactly 4 a.m. No alarm. His body had learned years ago that sleep beyond 4 hours was inefficient. He rose in the dark, dressed in athletic, were selected the night before, and descended to his private gym. 45 minutes of cardio, 30 minutes of strength training, 15 minutes of stretching. The routine never varied. Variation was the enemy of excellence. By 5:30 a.m., he was showered and seated at his kitchen island, reviewing market reports from Asia while consuming a precisely measured breakfast: 2 eggs, scrambled, half an avocado, a bowl of mixed berries. Green tea, never coffee. Coffee, he decided long ago, created dependency. He would not be dependent on anything or anyone. His assistant, Marcus, arrived at 6:15 a.m. to brief him on the day's schedule. Marcus had worked for Owen for 3 years and had never once been late. He had also never been invited to sit down during these morning briefings. They stood across from each other in the gleaming kitchen, Marcus reading from his tablet, while Owen absorbed information with the focused intensity of a machine processing data. Board meeting at 9. Presentation on the Singapore acquisition at 11. Lunch with the mayor's office at 1. They want to discuss the waterfront development project. Conference call with London at 3. Dinner is open, but you have 2 requests: Senator Whitmore's chief of staff and that journalist from the Financial Times. Decline both. Owen said without looking up from his tablet. I'll eat here. Marcus nodded, made a note, and continued. Also, the gala for the Children's Hospital Foundation is Saturday. They're expecting your keynote. Owen paused. What's the focus? Healthcare access for underserved communities. Send me the data on their recent initiatives. I'll build the speech around measurable outcomes. He glanced up briefly. Anything else? That's everything, sir. Good. I'll be in the car in 10 minutes. Marcus left without another word. That was how Owen preferred it. Efficient, clean, no lingering, no small talk about weather or family or how anyone slept. Those conversations served no purpose. They were social lubricants for people who hadn't learned that relationships were simply transactions in disguise. The drive to Caldwell Technologies headquarters took exactly 23 minutes. Owen used every second. He reviewed contracts, approved expenditures, declined meeting requests, and responded to emails with replies that rarely exceeded 3 sentences. His driver, an older man named Robert who had been with the family for 15 years, never spoke unless spoken to. Owen appreciated that. The silence allowed him to think. Other executives arrived at the office around 8 or 9. Owen was at his desk by 7, and by the time his management team filtered into the building, he had already completed what most of them would consider a full day's work. His office occupied the entire top floor, a space designed with the aesthetic warmth of a surgical suite. Glass, steel, white surfaces, nothing personal. No photos, no plants, no evidence that a human being actually spent 60 hours a week there. His executive team respected him. Some admired him. Most feared him, not because he yelled or threw things or berated them publicly. Owen never raised his voice. He simply had a way of looking at you when you failed to meet expectations that made you feel as though you'd personally disappointed the concept of competence itself. His critiques were delivered in calm, measured tones that somehow cut deeper than any outburst could. This projection is based on optimistic assumptions that don't align with historical performance, he might say, and the room would go silent. Redo it. Use conservative models. Have it on my desk by end of day. No one argued. No one made excuses. They simply left and did what he asked because the alternative was becoming one of the many talented people who used to work for Owen Caldwell. During meetings, Owen sat at the head of the table, his posture perfect, his attention absolute. He never checked his phone. He never looked distracted. When someone spoke, he listened with an intensity that made people nervous. He would wait until they finished, let a beat of silence hang in the air, and then dismantle or approve their idea with a few precise sentences. His colleagues often joked, though never to his face, that working for Owen was like being cross-examined by a robot that had studied law at Harvard. But Owen wasn't a robot. He was something more complicated. He was a man who had learned very early that feelings were vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities got you hurt. He had been 4 years old when the storm came, a late spring thunderstorm that forecasters said would be routine. His parents had been driving back from a charity dinner, his mother still in her gown, his father in his tuxedo. The rain hit harder than expected. The road curved where it shouldn't have. The car went off the bridge into the river below. Owen had been asleep when the police arrived. Grace had been the one to answer the door. Grace had been the one to sit with him in the days that followed, when a house filled with strangers in dark suits speaking in hushed voices. She had been the one who held him when he woke up screaming, convinced the rain was coming for him too. For months, Owen wouldn't sleep unless Grace was sitting in the chair beside his bed. He would reach out in the dark to make sure she was still there, and her hand would find his, warm and steady. "I'm here, baby," she would whisper. "You're safe. I'm not going anywhere." But somewhere along the way, between childhood and adolescence, between grief and ambition, Owen had stopped reaching out. He had stopped crying. He had stopped needing anyone. The mansion, with all its empty rooms and controlled environments, had become his fortress. Grace had remained, but she had faded into the background of his awareness, a constant presence that no longer required acknowledgement. By the time Owen was 16, he was already managing parts of the family trust. By 22, he had taken control of Caldwell Technologies and tripled its value in 4 years. By 30, he was being profiled in business magazines as one of the most ruthless and brilliant young CEOs in the country. And by 36, he had perfected the art of living without needing anyone. Colleagues invited him to dinners. He declined. Women expressed interest. He entertained brief, transactional relationships that ended when they started asking questions about his childhood or his feelings or what he wanted from life beyond quarterly earnings reports. He attended galas and fundraisers because they were good for business, not because he enjoyed them. He shook hands. He smiled at the right moments. He gave speeches that sounded warm and human. But the second the event ended, he left. Owen had assistants who managed his schedule, drivers who took him where he needed to go, a chef who prepared meals he barely tasted, housekeepers who cleaned spaces he hardly noticed, and advisors who told him he was brilliant. But he had no friends. No one who called just to talk. No one who knew what kept him awake at 3 a.m. or what he thought about when the meetings ended and the mansion went quiet. He told himself he preferred it that way. Connection required maintenance. It required vulnerability. It required letting people see the parts of you that didn't fit neatly into spreadsheets and strategy documents. And Owen had no interest in being seen. He had interest in being effective. That evening, after the board meeting and the presentations and the carefully controlled conversations, Owen returned home at exactly 6:47 p.m. Grace had set dinner on the table in the formal dining room. Though Owen had told her 100 times he didn't need her to do that. A single place setting, grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, a glass of water with exactly 3 ice cubes. He sat down and began to eat methodically, the way he did everything. He didn't taste the food. He simply consumed it because his body required fuel. The dining room was silent, except for the soft clink of silverware against porcelain. 32 rooms in this house, and he sat alone in every one of them. Halfway through the meal, Owen paused, his fork suspended in the air. He was thinking about the report, about Grace's name appearing in the system logs, about the missing items, about the fact that for 3 weeks he had been watching those alerts and convincing himself they didn't matter. But they did matter, not because of the items themselves. Soup and protein bars were irrelevant. What mattered was a breach of trust. What mattered was that someone he had known his entire life, someone who had been present for every significant moment of his childhood, might be taking things without asking. And the worst part, the part that was beginning to settle uncomfortably in his chest, was that he didn't know why. He thought about Grace the way he'd seen her that evening, standing in the foyer with her swollen hands and her quiet voice. He tried to remember the last time he'd actually looked at her, really looked, not just glanced in her direction while walking past, but stopped and asked how she was. When was the last time he'd noticed that she moved slower than she used to, that her hands trembled slightly when she held things, that she sat down more often, as if standing had become painful. Owen set his fork down, the food suddenly tasteless in his mouth. He realized with a strange, uncomfortable clarity that he had no idea what Grace's life looked like outside this house. He didn't know where she lived. He didn't know if she had family. He didn't know what she did on her days off, or what worried her, or what made her happy. She had been part of his world for 32 years, and he knew almost nothing about her beyond the fact that she showed up, did her job, and left quietly when the day was done. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Owen felt something that didn't fit neatly into his carefully organized emotional framework. He felt worry, and beneath that, something even more uncomfortable. Guilt. He pushed his plate away, the meal half finished, and sat in the silence of the enormous dining room. The smart lights adjusted automatically, dimming slightly as the sun set beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The house responded to his presence, but it felt emptier than usual. Owen stood and walked to the window, looking out over the manicured grounds that stretched toward the tree line. Somewhere beyond those trees, Grace was finishing her own evening. Somewhere out there, she was living a life he had never bothered to ask about. The system alert was still on his tablet, waiting for him to investigate further. He could pull up the detailed logs. He could review the security footage. He could see exactly what Grace had taken and when. But for the first time in his professional life, Owen hesitated, because some part of him, buried beneath decades of control and calculation, understood that once he looked, once he confirmed what the data was telling him, something would change. The world he had built, where everything had its place and everyone served their function, would shift in ways he couldn't predict or manage. And Owen Caldwell hated not being able to predict outcomes. He stood there as the light faded, his reflection ghostly in the glass, a solitary figure in a house built for a family he no longer had. The worry he felt was unfamiliar, unwelcome, and growing stronger by the minute. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow, he would look at the footage. Tomorrow, he would find out what Grace was doing. But tonight, he would sit with this strange, uncomfortable feeling that something he had taken for granted his entire adult life was about to be revealed as far more fragile than he'd ever imagined. Grace Porter was 67 years old, though most days her body felt closer to 80. She had been born in a small town outside Augusta, Georgia, in a house with a leaking roof and floors that had grown under the weight of too many people and not enough money. Her mother had cleaned houses. Her father had worked in a textile mill until his lungs gave out. Grace learned early that survival meant working harder than the people who had more than you, and complaining never. She had come north at 23 with a baby girl on her hip and another growing inside her, running from a man whose love had turned violent in ways that left bruises you couldn't always see. She'd found work cleaning offices at night, then homes during the day, sleeping in shifts, surviving on coffee and the stubborn belief that her daughters would have better than she did. By the time she was 30, Grace had buried that dream of going back to school, of becoming a nurse like she'd once imagined. Life had other plans. Her daughters needed food, needed clothes, needed a mother who showed up even when her feet ached and her back screamed. So she showed up every single day. The Caldwell family had hired her when she was 35. Owen's mother, Catherine, had been looking for someone reliable, someone who could manage a large household with discretion and grace. The pay was better than anything Grace had seen. The hours were long, but they were steady. She'd taken the job without hesitation, grateful for the stability, for the chance to finally breathe without wondering if the rent would be late again. In those early years, Grace had been one of 4 housekeepers. The mansion had been full of life then. Dinner parties, charity events, Owen's parents hosting gatherings that stretched late into the night. Grace had worked alongside the others, learning the rhythms of wealth, the unspoken rules about what to notice and what to ignore. But after the accident, after the funeral, after the relatives came and went and the house emptied of everyone except a small boy who couldn't stop crying, Grace had stayed. Not because she was asked to, but because she couldn't leave him. Owen had been 4 years old and shattered in ways that made Grace's chest hurt just to look at him. He would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, convinced the rain was coming to take him too. He stopped eating, stopped talking, just sat in his room staring at nothing, his small body rigid with a grief he was too young to understand. Grace had sat with him, Night after night, she'd pulled a chair beside his bed and held his hand until he fell asleep. She'd made him soup he wouldn't eat and told him stories until his eyes finally closed. She'd been there the first time he'd laugh again months later, when she'd made a silly face and he'd forgotten to be sad for just a moment. She'd taught him to tie his shoes. She'd walked him to the bus stop on his first day of school. She'd held him when he came home crying because the other kids asked where his parents were. She'd been there for every nightmare, every fever, every moment when the world felt too big and too scary. In those years, Grace hadn't been just a housekeeper. She'd been the person who loved him, the person who stayed. But children grow up, and as Owen grew, the distance between them grew too. He stopped needing her to sit by his bed. He stopped crying when it stormed. He stopped reaching for her hand. By the time he was a teenager, he barely looked at her. By the time he was running the company, she had become invisible. Grace told herself it was natural. Boys became men. Men didn't need the women who raised them the way they used to. She'd raised her own daughters, watched them grow independent and distant in their own ways. It was the way of things. But some small part of her still ached when Owen walked past her in the hallway without a word, when he ate the meals she prepared without tasting them, when he came home and disappeared into his office without asking about her day. She was 67 now, and her body reminded her of that fact every morning. Her knees complained when she climbed stairs. Her ankles swelled by the end of the day, thick and tender. Her hands trembled when she gripped things too tightly, the arthritis settling into her joints like an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. She moved slower than she used to. It took her longer to clean rooms that once took half the time. She had to sit down more often, catching her breath, pressing a hand to her lower back where the pain lived. But she never complained, never asked for help. Owen didn't need to know that his housekeeper was getting old. That wasn't his burden to carry. Every evening, Grace finished her work, folded the dish towels, checked that everything was in order, and made her way to the bus stop at the end of the long driveway. She didn't own a car. Never had. The bus took her across the city, through neighborhoods that shifted from manicured lawns to cracked sidewalks, from boutique coffee shops to corner stores with barred windows. Her apartment was in a building that had seen better days. The hallways smelled faintly of mildew and someone's cooking. The elevator worked half the time. Grace lived on the third floor, a small one-bedroom with a kitchenette and a bathroom with a faucet dripped no matter how many times maintenance promised to fix it. But it was hers. She'd made it warm. Photos of her daughters on the walls. A crocheted blanket her mother had made draped over the worn couch. A small table by the window where she drank her tea in the mornings before the sun came up. Most nights, Grace came home exhausted. She'd heat up something simple, soup or leftovers, and eat standing at the counter, because sitting down meant she might not get back up. Then she'd wash her dish, check her phone for messages, and prepare for the next day. But 3 nights a week, Grace didn't go straight home. 3 nights a week, she carried a cloth bag filled with items she'd carefully selected from Owen's storage room. Items marked for disposal. Items that would have been thrown away. Cans of soup near their expiration date. Protein bars from bulk orders that no one ate. Bottles of antiseptic from the overstocked medical kit. She never took anything that would be missed. Never took anything that wasn't already destined for the trash. But she took them quietly, carefully, because there were people who needed them more than Owen's garbage bin did. Grace had learned years ago that the world didn't care about people who fell through the cracks. The system didn't catch everyone. Some people slipped through, and if you didn't help them, no one would. On those nights, Grace rode the bus deeper into the city, into neighborhoods where streetlights flickered and died, where buildings leaned like tired old men, where hope was a luxury most people couldn't afford. She got off at a stop near an old community center that looked like it might collapse if someone leaned on it too hard. The sign out front hung crooked. The windows were fogged with age. But inside there was warmth. Inside there were children waiting. Grace knocked twice on the side door and entered, her bag heavy on her shoulder. The children looked up when she arrived, their faces lighting up with a hope that broke her heart every single time. "Miss Grace is here," one of them whispered, and they gathered around her like she was bringing Christmas itself. She unpacked the items carefully, opened the cans, warmed the soup on a hot plate someone had donated, handed out the protein bars, cleaned small cuts with the antiseptic. She moved among them with a tenderness that came from a lifetime of caring for people who had no one else. And then, like he did every time, a small boy with asthma and eyes too old for his age ran to her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Grandma," he whispered. Grace held him close, her swollen hands gentle on his back. "I'm here, baby," she said softly. "I'm here." She didn't know that on this particular night, someone was watching. She didn't know that Owen Caldwell had followed her through the city, that he was standing outside in the cold, looking through the dusty window, seeing everything. She didn't know that the life she'd been living in secret was about to be exposed. She just held her grandson and served the children their meal, grateful for another night where no one went to bed hungry. And outside, in the darkness, Owen stood frozen, his entire world cracking open. Owen didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office on the second floor, the only light coming from his computer screen, casting his face in a pale blue glow. The house was silent around him, the kind of silence that amplified every thought, every doubt, every uncomfortable question he'd been avoiding. The inventory management system was open in front of him, displaying 3 weeks of data in neat, color-coded rows. Owen had designed the system himself, back when he'd first taken over Caldwell Technologies. It tracked everything: food supplies, household items, medical equipment, cleaning products, everything that came into the mansion and everything that left. The system was integrated with smart sensors throughout the storage areas, logging every entry, every exit, every item removed. It was foolproof, and that's what made this so disturbing. Owen scrolled through the logs, his jaw tight. October 24th, 9:47 p.m. 3 cans of vegetable soup, 1 bottle of antiseptic. Storage access, Grace Porter. October 29th, 9:52 p.m. 4 protein bars, 2 cans of tuna. Storage access, Grace Porter. November 3rd, 9:38 p.m. 2 cans of soup, 1 box of bandages, 3 protein bars. Storage access, Grace Porter. November 8th, 9:41 p.m. 5 protein bars, 1 bottle of children's pain reliever. Storage access, Grace Porter. November 12th, 9:55 p.m. 2 cans of soup, 1 tube of antibiotic ointment. Storage access, Grace Porter. November 14th, 9:49 p.m. 3 protein bars, 2 cans of beans. Storage access, Grace Porter. Every entry was time-stamped after Owen had gone to bed. Every item removed was small, easily concealed, and every single access point led back to the same person. Owen leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. He wanted to find an error. He wanted to discover that the system had malfunctioned, that someone had tampered with the logs, that there was some technical explanation that would make this all go away. But there was no error. The system didn't lie. The timestamps were precise. The item descriptions were accurate. He'd even cross-referenced the logs with the security camera footage from the hallways. Every time the system flagged an entry, the camera showed Grace entering the storage area, staying for 2 to 3 minutes, and leaving with her cloth bag slightly fuller than when she'd arrived. Owen clicked through the video files, watching Grace move through the footage. She didn't look suspicious. She didn't glance around nervously or rush. She simply walked into the storage room with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times, selected what she needed, and left. He paused the video on a frame where Grace was reaching for a can on the shelf. Her hand was trembling. Her shoulders were slightly hunched. Even in the grainy security footage, she looked tired. Owen stared at the frozen image, something uncomfortable twisting in his chest. "She's 70, he muttered to himself. Maybe she's confused. Maybe she forgot she's not supposed to take things without asking. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Grace had worked in this house for 32 years. She knew the rules. She'd never taken anything without permission before. Not once in 3 decades had there been a single inventory discrepancy attributed to her. Until now. Owen closed the video file and pulled up a detailed breakdown of the missing items. He studied the list, looking for a pattern. Soup, protein bars, antiseptic, bandages, pain reliever, tuna, beans, ointment. Nothing expensive, nothing valuable. Most of the items were nearing their expiration dates. Things Owen's automated reordering system would replace soon anyway. If Grace wanted to steal something, why would she take food that was about to be thrown out? It didn't make sense, unless she needed them. Owen's fingers hovered over keyboard. He could send Marcus to investigate. He could call Grace into his office and ask her directly. He could even report it to the police if he wanted to be brutal about it. But something stopped him. Maybe it was a memory of Grace sitting beside his bed when he was 4 years old, her hand holding his while he cried. Maybe it was the uncomfortable realization that he'd spent 30 years barely looking at her, barely acknowledging that she existed beyond her function in his household. Maybe it was the fact that confronting her felt too much like admitting he'd failed to notice something important about someone who'd once been the most important person in his world. Whatever the reason, Owen made a different decision. He would follow her. He would see where she went after work. He would see what she did with the items she was taking. And then once he understood, once he had all the information, he would decide what to do next. It was how he approached every problem in business. Gather data, analyze the situation, make an informed decision. Emotion didn't enter into it. This was just another problem that needed solving. At least, that's what he told himself. Over the next 2 days, Owen prepared like he was planning a covert operation. He had his car's windows tinted darker, dark enough that no one could see inside even in daylight. He disabled the automatic headlights and adjusted the settings so the vehicle would run as quietly as possible. He mapped out the bus routes from his estate into the city, identifying the likely paths Grace would take. He downloaded a tracking app on his phone, tested it multiple times to ensure it wouldn't fail. He even changed the schedule, clearing his evening meetings so he'd be home when Grace finished her shift. Marcus noticed the changes. "You're leaving early again?" he asked on Thursday afternoon, confusion evident in his voice. Owen never left early. Owen was the person who stayed latest, who worked through dinners, who sent emails at midnight. Personal matter, Owen said without elaborating. Marcus didn't push. No one pushed Owen Caldwell. On Thursday evening, Owen positioned himself in his study with a clear view of the driveway. He watched Grace through the window as she finished her work. She moved through the house with her usual quiet efficiency, straightening pillows, checking surfaces, adjusting things that didn't need adjusting. At 9:35 p.m., she folded her apron, hung it on the hook in the mudroom, and pulled on her worn cardigan. She picked up her cloth bag, the same bag Owen had seen in the security footage, and slung it over her shoulder. Owen was already moving. He slipped out through the garage, got into his car, and waited. The engine purred so quietly it was almost inaudible. He'd parked in a position where he could see the driveway, but remained hidden in shadow. Grace emerged from the side entrance, walking slowly down the long driveway toward the main road. Her pace was careful, measured. She favored her left leg slightly, something Owen had never noticed before. When she reached the end of the driveway, she stood beneath the streetlight at the bus stop, pulling her cardigan tighter against the November chill. Owen waited. A few minutes later, the bus appeared, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Grace boarded slowly, gripping the handrail as she climbed the steps. The bus pulled away, and Owen followed at a distance, keeping 2 or 3 cars between them. The drive took them deeper into the city, through neighborhoods that grew progressively less polished. The streetlights became more sporadic, the buildings older, the sidewalks cracked and uneven. Owen had lived in the city his entire life and had never seen these streets. The bus made several stops, passengers getting on and off, but Grace remained seated near the front. Owen followed patiently, his hands steady on the wheel, his mind running through possibilities. Finally, after nearly 40 minutes, Grace stood and made her way to the exit. The bus stopped in a neighborhood where the buildings looked tired, where trash collected in the corners, where even the air seemed heavier. Owen parked half a block away and watched as Grace walked down the sidewalk. She moved past a liquor store with barred windows, past a laundromat where the machines sat broken and dark, past houses with peeling paint and sagging porches. She turned down a narrow alley. Owen got out of his car and followed on foot, staying in the shadows. The alley opened into a side street where an old building stood, its sign hanging crooked, Riverside Community Center. Grace knocked twice on the side door and entered. Owen approached slowly, his heart beating harder than it had in years. He moved to one of the foggy windows and peered through the dusty glass. What he saw stopped him cold. Children, at least 15 of them, maybe more, some sitting on folding chairs, some on the floor. Their clothes were thin for the weather. Their faces were a mixture of hope and hunger. They were waiting quietly, patiently, their eyes fixed on Grace as she set down her bag and began unpacking. The missing items appeared one by one. Soup cans, protein bars, antiseptic, bandages. Grace opened the cans with steady hands despite the trembling. She warmed the soup on a small hot plate. She handed out the protein bars with a smile. She cleaned a small girl's scraped knee with the antiseptic, her touch gentle, her voice too quiet for Owen to hear but clearly soothing. And then a boy, small, maybe 7 or 8, ran to Grace and wrapped his arms around her waist. Owen couldn't hear what the boy said, but he saw Grace's face soften in a way he hadn't seen in years. She held the child close, stroking his hair, and when she pulled back, there were tears in her eyes. Owen stumbled backward from the window, his breath coming short. Grace wasn't stealing. She was saving. He stood there in the cold November night, outside a broken community center, in a neighborhood his money had never touched, and felt something inside him crack open. The woman he'd suspected of theft was feeding hungry children with food he would have thrown away. The woman he'd followed like a criminal was acting like a saint. And he, Owen Caldwell, billionaire philanthropist, man who gave speeches about equity and justice, had never once thought to ask if the person who raised him needed help. He walked back to his car in a daze, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. For the first time in 30 years, Owen Caldwell felt ashamed. The next evening, Owen was ready. He'd left work at 6, claiming fatigue that Marcus accepted without question, but clearly didn't believe. By 8:30, Owen was in his car, parked in the shadows of his own estate, engine running silent, windows tinted dark enough to disappear into the night. At 9:32 p.m., Grace emerged from the side entrance. Owen watched her descend the driveway, her pace slower than he remembered from his childhood, her gait careful and deliberate. She carried the cloth bag over her shoulder, and even from this distance, he could see it was fuller than when she'd arrived that morning. She reached the bus stop and sat on the bench beneath the streetlight, her shoulders rounded with exhaustion. For a moment, she closed her eyes, and Owen felt something uncomfortable move through his chest. She looked small sitting there, fragile, nothing like the steady, capable woman who had held him together when he was too young to hold himself. The bus arrived 7 minutes later. Grace stood slowly, gripping the pole as she climbed the steps, and disappeared inside. Owen pulled out behind the bus, keeping a careful distance. 2 cars between them, 3 when traffic allowed. He'd studied the route options, prepared for multiple scenarios, but as the bus moved through the city, he realized Grace's destination wasn't on any of the main routes he'd anticipated. The journey took them east, away from the financial district and the renovated waterfront developments Caldwell Technologies had invested in. The buildings grew shorter, older. Glass and steel gave way to brick and concrete. The cars on the street were older too, some with dents and mismatched panels, some held together by determination rather than engineering. Owen had lived in this city for 36 years and had never driven these streets. The transition was gradual at first. Boutique coffee shops became chain fast food restaurants. Yoga studios became laundromats. Art galleries became pawn shops with bar windows and neon signs promising cash for gold. But then the change accelerated. The middle-class neighborhoods gave way to blocks where the sidewalks were cracked and uneven, where trash collected in the corners because pickup schedules were unreliable, where streetlights flickered or didn't work at all. Buildings leaned slightly, their foundations settling in ways that made them look tired. Windows were covered with cardboard or bars. Doors hung crooked in their frames. This was the part of the city that didn't appear in the economic development reports Owen reviewed. This was the part that existed in statistics, but never in his actual field of vision. The bus made several stops. People got on and off. their faces worn, their movements weary. Grace remained seated near the front, her hands folded over her bag, her head occasionally nodding forward before she caught herself. Owen followed, his grip tight on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. Every block they traveled felt like crossing into foreign territory. These weren't war zones or disaster areas. They were just forgotten places. Places where the city's money and attention had never quite reached. Places where people lived entire lives that Owen's world never touched. After 43 minutes, Gray stood and moved toward the exit. The bus stopped in front of a liquor store with metal grates over the windows and graffiti tags covering the lower walls. Owen parked half a block behind, killed the engine, and watched. Gray stepped off the bus carefully, holding the rail, her ankles clearly swollen beneath her pants. She adjusted her bag and began walking down the street, past the liquor store, past a laundromat where only 2 of the 8 machines had working signs taped to them, past a row of houses that looked like they'd been beautiful once, decades ago, before time and neglect had stripped them down to survival. She turned down a narrow alley. Owen got out of his car and followed on foot, keeping to the shadows, his expensive shoes silent on the cracked pavement. His heart was beating harder than it should, harder than it did in board meetings or negotiations worth millions. This felt different. This felt personal. The alley opened onto a side street where a building stood alone, separated from the houses by a chain-link fence with gaps torn in the mesh. The building was 2 stories, brick, with windows that were foggy with age and grime. A sign hung above the door, one corner lower than the other. The letters faded but still legible. Riverside Community Center. The paint was peeling. The steps leading to the entrance were cracked. A gutter hung loose on one side, dangling like a broken arm. Grace climbed the steps slowly, gripping the railing, and knocked twice on a side door that looked like it had been repaired multiple times. The door opened from inside, and she disappeared into the building. Owen stood in the alley, his breath visible in the November cold, debating. He'd followed her this far. He'd seen where she went. That should be enough. But it wasn't enough. He needed to know what she was doing inside. He moved quietly across the street and approached the building from the side, where several windows faced the alley. They were covered in years of dust and grime, but through one of them, he could see light and movement. Owen pressed closer, wiping a small circle in the dirt with his sleeve, and peered inside. What he saw hollowed him out. Children, 15, maybe 20 of them, ages ranging from maybe 5 to 12 or 13. They sat on folding chairs on the floor, some with backpacks that looked older than they were, some with jackets too thin for the cold, some with shoes held together by duct tape. Their faces carried an expression Owen recognized from business. The look of people waiting for something they hoped would come, but weren't sure they deserved. Grace stood in the center of the room, setting her bag down on a folding table. The children's eyes tracked her every movement, hungry in a way that had nothing to do with manners and everything to do with necessity. She opened the bag and began removing items. Soup cans, protein bars, a bottle of antiseptic, bandages, the missing inventory. Owen watched as Grace opened the cans with a manual can opener that looked like it dated back to the 1970s. She poured the soup into paper bowls, heated them one at a time on a small hot plate on the corner of the table. She handed out the protein bars carefully, making sure each child got one. Her movements were slow but purposeful, her hands trembling slightly, but her face calm, focused, loving. A small girl approached with a scrape on her knee, the skin around it red and angry. Grace knelt down, slowly, wincing as her knees bent, and cleaned the wound with antiseptic. She applied ointment with gentle fingers and covered it with a bandage. She said something to the girl that made her smile, and the girl hugged Grace's neck before running back to her seat. Owen's throat tightened. This came from good people who have enough to share, Grace said, her voice carrying through the window. So when you eat, you remember there's kindness in this world. You remember that somebody cares. She never said Owen's name, never claimed credit, never mentioned the mansion or the billionaire who threw away more food in a week than these children saw in a month. She just served them, one by one, with a dignity that made each child feel seen. Owen pressed his hand against the cold brick wall, his vision blurring. This was what she'd been doing. This was where the missing items had gone. She hadn't stolen anything. She'd rescued what he would have discarded and turned it into hope for children who had none. And then, as Owen was trying to process what he was seeing, a small boy burst through a door at the back of the room. He was thin, maybe 7 or 8, with a jacket that hung loose on his frame and shoes that were splitting at the seams. The boy ran straight to Grace, his face lighting up with pure, unguarded joy. "Grandma!" he shouted. Grace turned, and her entire expression transformed. The weariness fell away. The pain in her movements disappeared. She opened her arms, and the boy crashed into her with the force of someone who had been waiting all day for this moment. She held him tight, so tight, rocking him slightly, her eyes closed, her face pressed against his hair. "Hey, baby," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Did you have a good day?" The boy nodded against her shoulder, not letting go. Owen stumbled backward from the window, his hand over his mouth, his chest constricting. Grandma! Grace had a grandson. Grace had family Owen knew nothing about. Grace had an entire life he'd never asked about, never wondered about, never acknowledged. And she'd been feeding these children, feeding her own grandson, with items Owen had marked for disposal. He leaned against the wall, unable to breathe properly, unable to reconcile the woman inside that broken community center with the woman he'd suspected of theft, unable to reconcile the warmth and love she was pouring into those children with the cold, transactional relationship he'd maintained with her for decades. Inside, Grace was ladling soup into bowls. She was wiping tears from a little girl's face. She was checking another child's forehead for fever. She was laughing softly at something one of them said. She was doing what she'd always done, taking care of people who needed her. Owen pushed away from the wall and walked back to his car in a daze. His hands were shaking. His breath came in short, uneven bursts. The carefully controlled world he'd built, where everything had its place and everyone served their function, had just been revealed as a lie. He'd been living in a mansion, surrounded by wealth he couldn't spend in 3 lifetimes, while the woman who raised him had been quietly saving children with his garbage. He sat in his car for a long time, staring at the community center, watching Grace's silhouette move behind the dirty windows. And for the first time since he was 4 years old and crying for parents who would never come home, Owen Caldwell felt the full weight of his own blindness. He started the car and drove back to the neighborhoods, seeing them differently now, seeing the people differently, seeing everything differently. By the time he reached his estate, the mansion felt less like a home and more like a monument to everything he'd gotten wrong. Owen didn't go home that night. He drove aimlessly through the city until dawn, replaying what he'd seen through that dusty window, unable to make it fit with the world he thought he understood. By the time the sun rose, he'd made a decision. He needed answers. Real answers. Not assumptions. Not data from a screen. He needed to talk to Grace. At 8:47 a.m., Owen texted Marcus and canceled his entire day. Meetings, conference calls, a lunch with investors, all of it cleared without explanation. Marcus responded with confused acknowledgement, but knew better than to ask questions. Owen waited until evening. He couldn't confront Grace at the mansion, not surrounded by the evidence of his wealth, not in a space where the power dynamic would make honest conversation impossible. So he went back to the neighborhood, back to the community center. He arrived just after 7, parking in the same spot as the night before. The building looked even more defeated in daylight. The brick was crumbling in places. The roof sagged slightly in the middle. A rusted playground sat behind a chain-link fence, swings hanging motionless, the slide covered in graffiti. Owen walked to the front entrance and tried the door. Unlocked. Inside, the air smelled of old wood, an industrial cleaner fighting a losing battle against mildew. The hallway was narrow, lit by fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered. Bulletin boards on the walls displayed faded notices about GED classes and job training programs that looked like they hadn't been updated in years. He heard voices coming from a room at the end of the hall. Children's laughter. Grace's voice, soft and warm. Owen approached slowly, his footsteps echoing on the worn linoleum. The door was partially open. He could see inside without entering. Grace sat at the same folding table from the night before, helping a young boy with homework. Her grandson, Owen assumed, The boy was thin, his cheeks slightly hollow, his breathing audible even from the doorway, a faint wheeze with each exhale. On the table beside the homework sat an inhaler, blue and white, well used. Grace noticed the wheezing and paused, her hand moving to the boy's back. "Deep breath, baby," she said gently, slow and steady. The boy nodded and reached for the inhaler, taking 2 puffs with practiced efficiency. Grace watched him carefully, counting silently, making sure he held his breath long enough for the medicine to work. Owen felt something twist in his chest. He knocked softly on the doorframe. Grace's head snapped up, her eyes widening when she saw him. For a moment, she looked frightened. Then the fear was replaced by something else, resignation, maybe, or acceptance. "Mr. Caldwell," she said quietly, standing slowly. Her hands gripped the edge of the table for support. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I know," Owen said. "I'm sorry. I should have—" He stopped, realizing he didn't know how to finish that sentence. "Should have what? Called first? Not followed her? Not spent 3 decades ignoring her existence?" Grace turned to her grandson. "Elijah, why don't you go practice your reading in the other room for a bit?" The boy looked between Grace and Owen, confused but obedient. He gathered his things and left, glancing back once before disappearing down the hall. Grace lowered herself back into the chair, wincing as her knees bent. Owen noticed for the first time how swollen her ankles were, how her shoes, worn, the leather cracked and splitting, barely contained the swelling. "You followed me," Grace said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, because of the inventory logs." Owen nodded. "I saw the alerts. I saw your name. I didn't understand, so He trailed off, the words sounding pathetic even to him. "So you decided to investigate instead of asking me directly." Grace's voice was calm, not accusatory, just stating fact. "I'm sorry." Grace was quiet for a moment, her hands resting on the table. Owen could see them trembling slightly, the joints swollen, the knuckles twisted in ways that suggested years of pain she'd never mentioned. "You want to know why I took those things?" Grace said. "I want to know everything," Owen replied. "I want to know why I never knew you had a grandson, why I never knew you needed help, why you've been feeding children with food I would have thrown away." Grace looked at him for a long moment, and Owen saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before. Exhaustion, not just physical, but the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been carrying weight alone for too long. "Sit down," she said finally. Owen sat in one of the folding chairs across from her. The metal was cold through his expensive suit pants. Grace took a breath. "Elijah is 7. His mother was my youngest daughter, Michelle. She died 5 years ago." Owen felt the words hit him like a physical blow. "I didn't know. Grace, I'm so—" "You didn't know because I never told you," Grace interrupted gently. "It wasn't your burden to carry. You had your own life, your own company. I was just the housekeeper. You were never just—" "Let me finish." Grace's voice was soft but firm. "Michelle got sick. Started with what we thought was a bad cold. Turned into pneumonia. She went to the emergency room twice, and both times they turned her away. Said the wait was too long. Said she should try an urgent care clinic. Said a lot of things that basically meant they didn't want to deal with a black woman with no insurance." Owen's jaw clenched. By the time a hospital finally admitted her, the infection had spread. She died 3 days later. Elijah was 2 years old. Grace's voice didn't waver, but her hands did. They shook against the table, and Owen had to fight the urge to reach for them. "I had some savings," Grace continued. "Not much, but enough that I thought I'd be okay. But funeral costs, medical debt from those 3 days in the hospital, legal fees to get custody of Elijah, it took everything. I had to sell my house. I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in a building where the elevator barely works, and the heat goes out every winter." She paused, looking down at her swollen hands. "I tried to work more hours, but my body isn't what it used to be. Arthritis, bad knees. My back went out last year, and I couldn't work for 2 weeks. No sick days. No insurance of my own. I used what little I'd saved to cover rent and Elijah's asthma medication." Owen felt sick. "I wanted to be a nurse once," Grace said, her voice distant, remembering. Got accepted into a program when I was 21. But back then, they found reasons not to let black women finish. Failed me on practical exams I'd passed. Lost my application for clinical rotations. Eventually, I ran out of money and had to drop out. She looked up at Owen. So I became a housekeeper instead. And I was good at it. I took care of your family. I took care of you. You did more than take care of me, Owen said, his voice rough. You raised me. Grace smiled sadly. I did, and I'd do it again. But somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me, and I became invisible. That's what happens to people like me. We become part of the furniture. Owen wanted to argue, but he couldn't, because she was right. The children, Grace said, gesturing toward the door where Elijah had disappeared. Most of them live in this neighborhood. Some have parents working 2 or 3 jobs who can't always put food on the table. Some are being raised by grandparents like me. Some are in foster care. They come here after school because it's safe and because sometimes there's food. She pulled a stack of papers from her bag and set them on the table. Owen could see they were medical bills, past due notices, letters from collection agencies. I can't give them much, Grace continued, but I can give them something. So I started taking items from your storage room. Only things marked for disposal. Only things that were going to be thrown away anyway. Food near expiration. Medical supplies you'd ordered in bulk and never used. I never took anything that would be missed. You didn't steal anything, Owen said firmly. In your system, I did. The logs show you removing items that had no value to me but meant everything to them. Owen leaned forward. Grace, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you ask for help? Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. Because I've watched you for 30 years, Owen. I've watched you build walls so high that nobody can reach you. You turn grief into ambition and ambition into isolation. You don't let people in. You don't let people help you. Why would I think you let me ask for help? The words cut deeper than any business criticism ever had. And because, Grace continued, her voice breaking slightly, I didn't want you to see me as a burden. I didn't want to be another problem you had to solve. I just wanted to keep being the person who took care of you, even if you didn't notice anymore. Owen couldn't speak. His throat had closed completely. Grace wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Everything I took came from waste. Owen, I salvaged what you discarded. I turned your excess into their survival. And I'm not sorry I did it. You shouldn't be, Owen managed. I'm the one who should be sorry. He looked at the medical bills, at Grace's swollen hands, at her worn shoes and tired eyes. He thought about the mansion with its 32 rooms, most of them empty. He thought about the automated systems that tracked every can of soup while the woman who raised him was feeding children with what he threw away. I built a fortune, Owen said quietly, and I never saw the people right in front of me who were struggling to survive. Grace reached across the table and placed her trembling hand over his. You see now, she said softly. Owen looked at her, really looked at her, and felt the full weight of everything he'd missed. The pain she'd hidden, the sacrifices she'd made, the love she'd given to him, to Elijah, to children who weren't even hers, all while her own life was falling apart. I never knew you, he whispered. I never knew the woman who saved my life. You were a child when you needed saving, Grace said. You're a man now. Maybe it's time you learned who I really am. Owen sat in that cold community center, surrounded by evidence of Grace's hidden life, and felt something inside him break open. He had followed her expecting to find a thief. Instead, he'd found a hero he'd spent 30 years overlooking. And nothing would ever be the same. Owen was about to respond when Elijah's voice cut through the quiet, sharp with panic. Grandma! Grace's head snapped toward the door. Owen turned and saw the boy standing in the hallway, one hand pressed against the wall for support, the other clutching his chest. His breathing was rapid and shallow, each inhale producing a high-pitched wheeze that sounded like air being forced through a straw. Grace was on her feet instantly, pain forgotten. Elijah! Baby, where's your inhaler? The boy's eyes were wide with fear. He tried to speak, but couldn't get enough air. He pointed weakly back toward the room he'd left. Owen moved without thinking. He ran past Elijah into the other room, scanning frantically. Books, papers, a worn backpack. There, on the floor beneath a chair, the blue and white inhaler. He grabbed it and ran back, shoving it into Grace's hands. Grace shook the inhaler and brought it to Elijah's lips. Breathe out first, baby. All the way out. Elijah tried, but his chest was too tight. The wheeze had become a rasp. His lips were starting to turn pale. Grace administered 2 puffs, her hands remarkably steady despite the terror in her eyes. Hold it. Hold your breath. Count to 10 with me. Elijah held his breath, his small chest frozen, his eyes locked on Grace's face. They counted together. When they reached 10, Elijah exhaled, but the wheeze was still there, loud and labored. Again, Grace said, but Owen could hear the fear creeping into her voice. She gave him 2 more puffs. They counted again. This time when Elijah exhaled, the wheeze was worse. His shoulders were hunched forward, his body instinctively trying to create more space for air that wouldn't come. It's not working, Grace whispered. Her hands were shaking now. It's not working. Owen pulled out his phone. I'm calling an ambulance. No. Grace grabbed his arm. We can't afford. I don't care what it costs. Owen was already dialing. He can't breathe, Grace. The 911 operator answered on the second ring. Owen gave the address, described Elijah's symptoms, and was told an ambulance would arrive in approximately 12 to 15 minutes. 12 to 15 minutes felt like an eternity. Elijah's breathing was getting worse. Each inhale was a struggle. His chest was heaving, his small body working desperately for air that constricted airways wouldn't allow. But Elijah couldn't sit still. His body was in full panic mode, fighting for oxygen. He stood again, leaning forward, hands on his knees, the universal posture of someone who can't breathe. Owen knelt in front of him. Elijah, look at me. Look right at me. The boy's terrified eyes met his. You're going to be okay, Owen said, his voice calm and firm despite the fear churning in his gut. I know it's scary, but help is coming. Just try to take slow breaths, as slow as you can. Elijah nodded, tears streaming down his face, and tried, but his body wouldn't cooperate. The minutes crawled by. Grace stood behind Elijah, one hand on his back, whispering reassurances that sounded more like prayers. Owen stayed in front of him, maintaining eye contact, keeping him grounded. When the ambulance finally arrived, the paramedics moved with efficient speed. Oxygen mask, nebulizer treatment, questions fired at Grace while they worked. How long has he been like this? Is he on any medications? Any allergies? When was his last attack? Grace answered each question, her voice steady but her hands still trembling. They loaded Elijah onto a gurney. One of the paramedics turned to Grace. We're taking him to County General. You can ride with us. Owen stepped forward. I'm driving her. We'll meet you there. The paramedic nodded and climbed into the ambulance. Seconds later, the siren wailed and they were gone. Owen and Grace ran to his car. She was moving faster than he'd seen her move in years, adrenaline overriding pain. The drive to County General took 9 minutes. Owen broke every speed limit, his hands steady on the wheel, his mind focused on one single objective: get Grace to her grandson. They parked illegally near the emergency entrance and rushed inside. The waiting room was crowded. People with injuries, sick children, elderly patients slumped in chairs. The fluorescent lights were harsh. The air smelled of antiseptic and fear. Grace approached the desk. My grandson, Elijah Porter. He came in by ambulance. Asthma attack. The receptionist barely looked up. He's being assessed. You'll need to fill out these forms and take a seat. Someone will call you. Grace took the clipboard with shaking hands and sat down. Owen sat beside her, watching as she tried to focus on the forms. Her handwriting was unsteady. She got to the basic information, name, date of birth, address, and then stopped at the insurance section. She left it blank. 20 minutes passed. Then 40. Grace kept standing up, approaching the desk, asking for updates. Each time, she was told to wait. Each time, she returned to her seat more anxious than before. Finally, a nurse appeared. Grace Porter, Grace shot to her feet. Yes. How is he? He's stable. We've got him on a nebulizer and oxygen, but he needs to be admitted for observation and further treatment. Relief flooded Grace's face. Can I see him? The nurse's expression shifted, becoming more clinical. Before we proceed, we need to discuss insurance coverage. Does Elijah have insurance? Grace's relief evaporated. No, but I can pay. I can work something out. The nurse glanced at her tablet. Treatment for acute asthma exacerbation, including admission, observation, and medications, will likely run between $8,000 and $12,000. Do you have the ability to cover that? Owen watched the color drain from Grace's face. I have some money saved. I can make payments. Please, he's 7 years old. He can't breathe without help. The nurse's expression softened slightly, but her words didn't. We'll treat the immediate emergency, but without insurance or ability to pay, we can't admit him. Once he's stable, you'll need to follow up with a community clinic. That's unacceptable, Owen said, stepping forward. His voice was calm but carried the weight of absolute authority. The child stays. I'll cover all expenses. Put everything under my name. The nurse looked at him, taking in his expensive suit, his commanding presence. And you are Owen Caldwell. I'll provide my credit card and identification. Whatever paperwork you need, I'll sign. But he stays, and he gets whatever treatment he needs. The nurse nodded slowly. I'll let the doctor know. Follow me. They were led through a set of double doors into the emergency department. The sounds changed, beeping monitors, hurried footsteps, medical jargon being exchanged. They turned a corner, and Owen saw Elijah in a bed, an oxygen mask over his face, a nebulizer running. Grace rushed to his side, taking his small hand in hers. I'm here, baby. I'm right here. Elijah's eyes opened, still frightened but less panicked. His breathing was better, still labored but no longer desperate. Owen stood back, watching Grace stroke her grandson's forehead, watching her whisper reassurances, watching her entire world condense into this one fragile child on a hospital bed. The doctor appeared shortly after, a tired woman in her 50s with kind eyes. She explained that Elijah's asthma was severe, likely triggered by environmental factors and stress. He needed better medication, regular monitoring, and ideally, to be living in an environment with fewer triggers. He should stay overnight, the doctor said. We need to make sure his levels stabilize. Owen signed every paper they put in front of him. He provided his insurance information as a guarantor. He made it clear that cost was not a factor. As the night wore on, Grace sat in a chair beside Elijah's bed, refusing to leave, refusing to rest. Owen pulled up another chair and sat with her. Around midnight, Elijah finally fell asleep, his breathing slow and steady with the help of oxygen. Grace leaned back, exhaustion written in every line of her face. Thank you, she whispered. Owen shook his head. You don't need to thank me. I do, Grace insisted. If you hadn't been there... But I was there, Owen interrupted gently. And I'm staying. Grace looked at him, really looked at him, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of something that had been broken for too long. Owen stayed all night in that hospital room. He watched Grace doze fitfully in her chair. He watched Elijah sleep, his small chest rising and falling steadily. He watched nurses come and go, checking vitals, adjusting medication. And sometime in the early hours of the morning, as the hospital settled into its quietest rhythm, Owen realized something fundamental had shifted inside him. For 30 years, he'd lived in careful isolation, controlling every variable, eliminating risk, keeping everyone at arm's length. But sitting in his hospital room, watching over a child he barely knew and a woman he'd overlooked for decades, Owen felt something he hadn't felt since he was 4 years old. He felt connected, present, needed. He felt human. By dawn, Elijah was stable. The doctor cleared him for discharge with strict instructions and prescription medications that Owen personally ensured were filled before they left. As they walked out of hospital into the early morning light, Grace carrying a sleeping Elijah, Owen knew one thing with absolute certainty. He could never go back to the empty silence of his mansion and pretend nothing had changed. Everything had changed, and it was only the beginning. Owen returned to Caldwell Technologies on Monday morning after 3 days of absence. His assistant Marcus met him at the elevator with a tablet full of urgent notifications and an expression that bordered on panic. "Sir, the executive board has called an emergency meeting. They've been trying to reach you since Friday. When's the meeting?" 20 minutes. Conference room A. Marcus hesitated. "Sir, they're concerned." Owen took the tablet and scrolled through the messages. 12 missed calls from the CFO. 8 from the board chairman. 15 emails marked urgent. He handed it back without reading any of them. "Tell them I'll be there." Marcus nodded and disappeared. Owen went to his office, but he didn't sit down at his desk. Instead, he stood at the window overlooking the city, thinking about Elijah's small hand and Grace's, about the community center with its broken playground, about the children waiting for soup that came from his garbage. His phone buzzed. The chairman again. Owen ignored it. 20 minutes later, he walked into the conference room. 7 board members sat around the polished table, their expressions ranging from irritation to barely concealed anger. Robert Hartwell, the chairman and a man 15 years Owen senior, sat at the head of the table where Owen usually sat. "Nice of you to join us," Hartwell said coldly. Owen took a seat without apologizing. "Where have you been?" demanded Patricia Chun, the CFO. Her voice was sharp, clipped. "You missed the Singapore investor call. You missed the mayor's luncheon. You canceled an entire day of meetings with no explanation. I had a personal matter that required my attention." "A personal matter?" Hartwell leaned forward. "Owen, you're the CEO of a publicly traded company. You don't get to have personal matters that interfere with your responsibilities. We have shareholders. We have commitments. We have a 7-year-old child who nearly died because he couldn't afford proper medical care." Owen interrupted quietly. The room went silent. David Kowalski, head of operations, frowned. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that we operate in a city where children go to bed hungry, where hospitals turn people away because they can't pay, where people work full-time jobs and still can't afford rent." Owen's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "And we sit in this room talking about quarterly earnings and investor confidence while pretending those people don't exist." Patricia's eyes narrowed. "Is this about that community outreach proposal you mentioned last month?" "Owen, we discussed this. Corporate charity is fine for PR, but it needs to be strategic. It needs to show measurable returns." "Returns?" Owen's voice rose slightly. "We're talking about human beings, Patricia, not investments. We're talking about the company's image." Hartwell cut in. "And right now, that image is suffering. Investors are calling me asking why our CEO has suddenly become unreliable. The board is questioning your focus, your judgment." "My judgment is fine." "Is it?" Hartwell pulled out his own tablet and turned it toward Owen. "Because your behavior suggests otherwise. You've been distracted for weeks. You're missing critical meetings. And now you're sitting here lecturing us about poverty like you've suddenly developed a conscience." The words hung in the air, accusatory and sharp. Owen stared at the chairman for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Maybe I have." The room erupted. "This is exactly what we're talking about," Patricia said, her voice rising. "You're letting emotion cloud your business sense. You're getting personally involved in things that aren't your responsibility." "A child's life is my responsibility, not when it compromises a company." David interjected. "Owen, we respect your humanitarian impulses, but Caldwell Technologies is not a charity. We have obligations to our shareholders. We have a fiduciary duty to maximize value." "And what about our duty to the communities we operate in?" Owen shot back. "What about the people who live in the shadows of our developments? The people whose neighborhoods we gentrify while pricing them out of their own homes?" "That's not our problem to solve," Hartwell said flatly. "Then whose problem is it?" "The government's. Social services. Anyone but us." Hartwell's tone was dismissive. "Owen, I understand you're going through something. Maybe you need time off. Maybe you need to step back and... I'm not stepping back, Owen said firmly. I'm stepping forward. And I'm proposing we redirect 10% of our annual development budget toward community investment. The room exploded in protests. 10%. Patricia was on her feet. That's $30 million. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. That money is allocated, David said. It's committed to projects that have been in development for years. You can't just pull it and... We can do whatever we decide to do, Owen interrupted. This company belongs to its shareholders. Yes. But I'm the CEO, and I'm telling you we need to change direction. This is insane, Patricia said, looking around the table for support. This is emotional decision-making at its worst. You spent 3 days with some poor family, and now you want to restructure our entire development strategy. Owen's jaw clenched. That poor family is headed by the woman who raised me, the woman who worked for my family for 32 years, the woman who's been feeding hungry children with food I was throwing away while I sat in this building talking about maximizing shareholder value. The room went quiet again. Hartwell studied Owen carefully. This is about your housekeeper? Her name is Grace, Owen said. And yes, this is about her. It's about her grandson who almost died because he couldn't afford an inhaler. It's about the 15 other children she feeds every week because no one else will. It's about the fact that we built an empire in this city while people suffered in our blind spots. That's not our fault, Patricia insisted. Maybe not, Owen agreed, but it's our responsibility now because we have the resources to help and we've been choosing not to. Helping doesn't generate returns, David said. Maybe not the kind you're used to measuring, Owen replied. But impact matters. Legacy matters. And I'd rather be remembered as someone who actually did something than someone who just made money. Hartwell leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. You're serious about this? Completely? The investors will hate it. Some of them will, Owen acknowledged, but some of them will understand that sustainable business means investing in sustainable communities. And the ones who don't, they can sell their shares. Patricia looked horrified. You're willing to tank the stock price over this. I'm willing to accept short-term volatility for long-term transformation. Owen looked around the table, meeting each board member's eyes. I built this company on efficiency and control. I thought that's what leadership looked like. But I was wrong. Real leadership means having the courage to change when you realize you've been blind. The room was silent. Owen could see them processing, calculating, weighing the risks. Finally, Hartwell spoke. If we agree to this, and I'm not saying we are, what exactly are you proposing? Owen pulled out his phone and displayed a document he'd been working on since Saturday. Community health centers, after-school programs, housing assistance, small business grants for local entrepreneurs. We identify the neighborhoods most impacted by our developments, and we invest in them properly, not token gestures, real infrastructure. That's going to take more than $30 million, David said quietly. Then we'll allocate more. Patricia shook her head. The shareholders will revolt. Maybe, Owen said, or maybe they'll see that a company that actually cares about its impact is worth investing in for the long term. Budget breakdowns, impact projections, a communication strategy for the investors. And Owen, yes. If this fails, if the stock tanks, if the investors lose confidence, you're done. The board will remove you. Owen nodded slowly. Understood. Meeting adjourned. The board members filed out, most of them shaking their heads, a few whispering to each other. Patricia stopped at the door and looked back at Owen. I hope you know what you're doing, she said. So do I, Owen replied honestly. When the room was empty, Owen sat alone at the conference table, staring at his reflection in the polished surface. He'd just risked everything, his position, his reputation, the company he'd spent 15 years building. But as he thought about Elijah's face in that hospital bed, about Grace's trembling hands, about those children waiting in a broken community center for food that came from his success, Owen realized something. For the first time in his adult life, he'd made a decision based not on data or strategy or maximizing returns. He'd made a decision based on what was right. And whatever came next, he could live with that. The renovation of Riverside Community Center began 3 weeks later. Owen didn't just write a check and walk away. He showed up on the first day of construction. He arrived in jeans and a work shirt, standing alongside the contractors as they assessed the building's structural issues. The roof needed replacing. The foundation required reinforcement. The plumbing was decades past its useful life. The electrical system was a fire hazard. "We're not patching this," Owen told the lead contractor. "We're rebuilding it right." Over the next 2 months, the community center transformed. New roof, new windows that actually sealed against the cold, fresh paint inside and out, a commercial kitchen that met health codes, bathrooms that worked, a heating system that would keep children warm through winter. The playground was torn down and rebuilt with equipment designed for safety and joy. But the building was just the beginning. Owen established a Riverside Community Fund with an initial endowment of $15 million. It covered everything Grace had been struggling to provide alone: after-school programs, tutoring services, meals for children who needed them, health screenings, emergency assistance for families in crisis. And when the board asked who should run it, Owen didn't hesitate. "Grace Porter," he said. Grace had tried to refuse. "Owen, I'm a housekeeper. I don't know how to run a program like this." "You've been running it for years," he replied. "You just didn't have resources. Now you do." She became the director of community outreach, with a salary that allowed her to leave the mansion work behind. Owen hired staff to support her: social workers, tutors, a nurse, a grant writer. Grace coordinated it all with the same quiet competence she brought to everything else in her life, except now people finally saw her doing it. Owen didn't just fund the program. He participated in it. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, he showed up for tutoring sessions. He helped kids with math homework at tables he'd once walked past without noticing. He read with children who struggled. He listened to teenagers talk about their dreams of college, dreams that felt impossible until someone told them they weren't. Elijah became a fixture in Owen's life. The boy's asthma was under control now with proper medication and regular monitoring that Owen ensured never lapsed. On Saturdays, Owen picked him up and they'd go to museums or bookstores or just walk through parks, talking about school and superheroes and what Elijah wanted to be when he grew up. An engineer, Elijah said one afternoon as they sat on a bench feeding ducks. "Like you, I'm not an engineer," Owen said. "I'm a businessman. But you build things. You fixed our center. That's engineering." Owen smiled. "Maybe you're right." Elijah looked up at him seriously. "Grandma says you were sad for a long time, but you're not sad anymore." Owen's throat tightened. "No, I'm not sad anymore." "Good," Elijah said simply, and went back to throwing bread to the ducks. At the mansion, things changed too. Owen still lived there, but it felt different now. Less like a museum, more like a place he actually inhabited. He had dinner with Grace and Elijah at least twice a week, sitting at the kitchen table instead of the formal dining room, eating food they prepared together, laughing at Elijah's stories about school. Grace had tried to maintain the employer-employee boundary, but Owen wouldn't let her. "You're not my employee anymore," he said one evening. "You're family. You always were. I was just too blind to see it." Grace's eyes had filled with tears, but she'd smiled through them. "Took you long enough to figure that out." 6 months after the community center reopened, Grace received an invitation to speak at the National Conference on Urban Poverty and Community Solutions. The organizers had heard about the Riverside program and wanted her to share her approach. Grace was terrified. "I can't speak in front of hundreds of people, Owen. I'm not a public speaker." "You speak to children every day," Owen said. "You speak to families in crisis. You know exactly what to say. Just tell them the truth." The conference was held in a hotel ballroom that seated 400 people. Owen sat in the front row. Watching Grace take the stage and address she'd let him by her after much argument. She looked small behind the podium, but when she began speaking, her voice was clear and strong. She talked about hunger, about children who came to school unable to focus because they hadn't eaten, about families working full-time jobs but still choosing between rent and food, about systems that failed people and communities that forgot them. And then she said something that made the entire room go still. For years, I worked in a mansion while living in poverty myself. The man who owned that mansion was someone I'd raised from childhood. I watched him grow into a brilliant, successful man who had everything except the ability to see the people around him. Owen's chest tightened. But something changed, Grace continued, her voice softer now. He finally looked, really looked, and when he saw what I'd been hiding, when he saw the children I was feeding with his discarded food, he didn't turn away. He didn't judge. He asked how he could help, and then he actually did. She paused, her eyes finding Owen in the audience. That boy I raised, the one who forgot how to see people, he remembered. He became the man I always believed he could be, not because of his money or his success, but because he chose compassion over comfort. He chose presence over distance. Grace's voice cracked slightly. Sometimes the greatest change happens when someone finally sees you. And sometimes the person who needs to change the most is the one who is everything but sees nothing. The room erupted in applause. People stood. Owen stood too, his vision blurred, his heart too full for words. After the conference, they went back to the community center, where a small celebration was waiting. The children had made a banner that read, "Thank you, Miss Grace," in crayon and glitter. They'd baked cookies with the help of the new kitchen staff. They'd prepared speeches of their own, short and sweet, about what the center meant to them. Elijah spoke last. He stood on a chair so everyone could see him, his small voice carrying across the room. "Before I was scared a lot," he said. "Scared I couldn't breathe. Scared we didn't have enough. Scared Grandma was too tired. But now I'm not scared anymore, because Mr. Owen sees us. And when someone sees you, you don't have to be invisible anymore." The children clapped. Grace wiped her eyes. Owen had to step outside for a moment to compose himself. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home and the center was quiet, Owen found Elijah sitting on the front steps. The new playground lights cast a gentle glow over the yard. Owen sat down beside him. "You did good tonight. Your speech was perfect. Thanks." Elijah was quiet for a moment, then said, "Can I ask you something?" "Anything. Are you going to keep coming here, even when it's not new anymore?" Owen looked at the boy, this small person who'd somehow become essential to his life, and felt his heart crack open all over again. "Yes," he said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere. Elijah, I promise." Elijah nodded, satisfied. Then he leaned against Owen's shoulder, comfortable and trusting in a way that Owen had never allowed anyone to be with him before. They sat like that for a while, watching the lights, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood settling into evening. Finally, Elijah said quietly, "I see you, Mr. Owen." Owen's breath caught. Those 3 words, so simple, carried the weight of everything he'd been missing his entire life. To be seen, to be known, to matter to someone beyond what he could provide or produce. He put his arm around Elijah's shoulders and pulled him close. "I see you too," he whispered. And in that moment, sitting on the steps of the community center he'd rebuilt, holding a child who wasn't his by blood but had become his by choice, Owen Caldwell finally understood what wealth really meant. It wasn't the mansion or the company or the billions in his accounts. It was this: connection, presence, love given and received. It was being seen and choosing to see in return. It was finally, after 36 years of careful isolation, being part of family he'd chosen and who'd chosen him back. Grace came out and sat on his other side, the 3 of them together in the quiet night. "You did good, Owen," she said softly. He looked at her, this woman who'd saved him twice, once as a child and once as a man, and smiled. "We did good," he corrected. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Owen felt complete, not because he'd achieved something or built something or earned something, but because he'd finally learned to love something more than success. He'd learned to love people, and they'd loved him back. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.